Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar. My name is Robert Lemon. I'm going to introduce our other presenters here shortly. I know everyone's trickling in and joining the webinar as we speak. So just a quick introduction from me. As I said, my name is Robert Lemon and I'll be the moderator today. And our session is about government bonds. And I like the title, the name's bond, government bond. That's what we're going to be talking about today. I think it's a pretty exciting topic. I really like what the presenters have done with it. It's not just talking about the accounting treatment around bonds, but some of the practical considerations as well. So hopefully everyone takes some useful information from it. Again, really appreciate everybody joining us. As I see people still trickling in here, I'll just mention a couple of things whilst we give people time. You know, we do try and do at CRI, we do try and do a number of governmental CPE sessions throughout the year. So please keep your eyes peeled for those. We'll send invites to you, or you can find them on our website, cricpa.com, where you can also find a bunch of useful governmental information and articles and things. So you know, check that out if you're interested. Throughout the session today, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A. We'll either address them right away via the chat. We'll chat back to you, or maybe I'll turn it back to the presenters if I think it's one that should be addressed to them. So we'll get going here because I'm not seeing anyone else trickling in. So I think probably everyone's joined now. So we're going to go ahead and start moving through the slides. Let's see. Okay, so here's a bit of housekeeping items. This is going to be, this session is going to be worth 2 CPE credit hours. To get your credit, you need to be in the session for the full time and answer at least 80% of the polling questions. You don't need to get the polling questions correct, but you must answer 80% to get your credit. And to get credit, you do need to be logged in with your own unique link. So hopefully everybody here is logged in with their own unique login link to get their credit. We can offer, if you're here just for half of the time and get half of the polling questions, you can get 1 credit hour if you're not able to attend for the full 2, but we can't do 1.5 credit hours. We see 1 or 2 or 0 is what we can offer depending on how much time you're here and how many polling questions you get. So hopefully everyone gets the full credit, because I think these guys are going to do a terrific session for you, and you'll be engrossed and enthralled and won't want it to end and here for the full time. So you should receive your certificates for CPE within 7 days. Those will be emailed out to you. And if you do have questions, our marketing team, excellent marketing team, are able to help, and their email address is there on the slide. So and they're in red. I always get this question, so I'll mention it here. It's in red at the bottom there. If you want the slides, they are available through a download in the Zoom chat. I can see they're already up there, it looks like. So yes, if you want those slides, they are there for you to download. So let's dive in, keep moving through and introduce our presenters for the day. We have two fantastic presenters, 2 of my favorite guys at the firm. First up, one of our partners from Enterprise, Alabama, is Keith Hundley. Keith is a governmental specialist. He's done lots and lots of presentations. Actually, he's one of the leading partners who organizes our Southern Grants Forum, where we talk about all government grant type activities. So he's a fantastic presenter, really knows his stuff, and I know you're going to enjoy hearing from Keith today. So that's our first presenter. And our second presenter is a partner also from Enterprise, Alabama. His name is Tyler Dunaway, fantastic governmental specialist, really knows his stuff and has done a lot of good, brought a lot of good ideas to the presentation for talking about bonds, and he really knows his stuff on this topic. So you're going to enjoy hearing from Tyler today. And then there's me. I'm just the moderator today. I'm a governmental partner in Albuquerque. And I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, on the Q&A, sorry, and addressing questions that may come up, but just generally launching the polling questions, keeping things moving. And as I say, I'm just the moderator for today. But that's the team. Now for the agenda, what we're going to be covering, seven topics here. As I said earlier, we're not just going to talk about accounting treatment. That's just one of the 7 topics. We got some practical considerations here as well. So the team will cover how to obtain bond financing, the role of the bond rating agencies, understanding what ratings are and what the trends are at the moment, and the types of different bonds, reporting requirements. Then we will look at the accounting treatment, like I said, and then a little bit on arbitrage as well that could be relevant for some of you. So those are our 7 topics. I think it's going to be a really good session. So we'll start moving through now. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over. I think Tyler's going to lead us off and talk about obtaining bond financing.
Yeah, that's right, Rob. Good morning, and thank you to Rob for that kind introduction. We're looking forward to talking with you guys this morning. But before we get started, I do feel like Rob left one thing out, and that's that the title of this webinar, I have heard a lot of good feedback from, and I've had to tell every single person, unfortunately, that was all Rob's idea. So he was kind enough to talk about our accolades. So there's one accolade about Rob that just makes all of ours pale in comparison. So credit to Rob for coming up with that title. We're excited to talk with you guys this morning about bonds. I know over the last 10 years, we have seen in the governmental sector a significant amount of activity related to bonds. Interest rates have been historically low, so refundings are something that have been very popular. Bond issuances have been going on at a very high rate, and so we've seen a significant amount of activity related to that. I know Keith is going to get into this in more detail later, but obviously there's some uncertainty moving forward related to interest rates. So while we may not see as many refundings over the short term, we will definitely still see bond issuances. Unfortunately, projects that require bonds are not something that say, hey, let's hang around and wait until the interest rate market is perfect in order to have this infrastructure need to be upgraded or to build this building. And so while the interest rate environment is a little uncertain, bond issuances are definitely something that are still relevant, something that we'll still see a lot of. And so it's something that's important to you guys. So hopefully we can shed a little light on that this morning. Our website will have some information up over the next few weeks, and please do visit our website to find all kinds of information on governmental activity. One of the things that we utilized in this was the MSRB website, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. They govern this process for municipalities and have a lot of good guidance as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the first slide. Whenever you're looking at bond issuances, I think the first question that you need to ask is just a basic one. Is bond issuance the right option for us? And so here's a few questions that you can run through. Number one, can I pay for this as I go along with the project or obligation? And a lot of times you'll look at this, and this is an easy question to answer. There's no way that we can pay for this project without getting some financing or some assistance. And so this might be a quick conversation. For one of my governmental entities that I work with, a natural gas supplier, they had a big project coming up to where they were hooking into a new natural gas supplier for their customers. And in order to do this, they had to extend their pipeline pretty significantly. And so they went out and got bids and looked at a cost estimate, saw how much it was going to cost, and said, if we do this project in-house, we can actually probably pay for it over a few years, doing as much of the work ourselves as possible without having to get any financing, just using our savings. And so they asked themselves this question, and they stopped right there and went with that option to pay for it as they went. But that's not always an option that we can utilize. So moving on to question number 2, can I obtain a state or a federal grant to fund the project or obligation? I know that that's always an option that we look at. Sometimes that is available. I know one of the counties that I work with, they're looking at redoing one of their ag centers, and it's a significant project for them. And they're currently working with the state of Florida, trying to obtain a grant to fund that project. But sometimes that is also not an option. So then we go to the third option. Can I obtain bond financing for the project or obligation? And so that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. So if you've gone through all of those questions and decide that you do need a bond, then we're going to move on to what do we typically use bonds for? And some of the typical uses of bonds, you'll see them regularly in buildings, building libraries or schools or hospitals. Some kind of significant building project typically require the use of bonds. road construction and improvements. These projects cost a significant amount of money, and a lot of times significant projects in those areas also require a bond. And then also utility system infrastructure, your water systems, your sewer systems, gas, electrical, all of those infrastructure projects are a significant undertaking that require a significant amount of money. And those are also a pretty typical use for bonds. And then finally, mass transit, if you're looking at airports or subway systems or anything like that, typically we see those projects funded with the use of bonds. And so with that, we're going to take a break for just a second. We're going to go through our first polling question.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Let me launch the polling question and read it out. So the first question asks, what is an advantage of municipal bonds? I'm going to launch it, and the possible options are tax-free interest to investor, provides funding for public projects, low default rates, or is it all of the above? So I'm going to give everyone about 20 seconds here. I can see the answers are coming in pretty quickly, but make sure everyone gets their answer in for their CPE credit. I'll say it again, you don't need to get the question correct to get your CPE credit, but you must answer it. So I will give everyone a few more seconds. And Tyler, whilst I'm doing that, whilst I'm waiting, I'll thank you again for giving me the credit for the creative title. That was one of my more inspired moments of creativity. So thank you for that shout out. I'm going to give everyone about 5 more seconds here because a couple more people still to get their answers in for their CPE credit. So last few seconds before I end the poll. Going once, going twice. All right, I'm ending the poll here. And I will share the results. Tyler, you want to give feedback on those results?
Yeah, so all of these were correct answers. These are all advantages of municipal bonds. Yeah, so the correct answer was D, all of the above.
Okay, and it looks like we have another polling question. Is that right on the next slide? Want to bring up the next slide, I think? Yep, polling question 2 comes right after it. So I'll launch this one as well. And this one reads, what is not a typical use of a bond? Is it upgrading infrastructure, buildings and significant improvements, buying a vehicle, road construction? So which of these would not be a typical use of a bond? Again, I'll give about 20 seconds. These answers I see are coming in very quickly, so we're doing well. About 10 more seconds. Okay, last chance here to get your answers in, to get your CPE credit. Going once, going twice, and I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Tyler, how did people do with that one?
Yeah, correct. So most people guessed C, and that was the correct answer. Typically, we don't see bonds used for buying a vehicle. Potentially, you're buying some James Bond memorabilia. You might need a bond to afford it, but for the most part, no. All right, so we're going to move on. After the polling question, we're going to move on to talking about bond repayments. So whenever you're setting up a structure of your bond, typically you want the terms of the bond to match the life of the project that it is funding. So if you have an infrastructure project that you anticipate the project being useful and effective for 20 to 30 years, you don't want a bond that's 40 years or 50 years long to where you're paying for it after the project is no longer useful to your government. And so typically you want to match the terms of the bond to the life of the project. You'll see all different kinds of payment requirements. I've seen some bonds that have to be paid monthly, some that are paid quarterly, some that are paid semi-annually, some that are just paid annually. So you can structure that however you best see fit for your entity. And then finally, the principal is due on the maturity dates of the bonds. This is something that we'll get into a little more later whenever we're talking about refundings. But in the bond language, you'll see there are certain call dates. These are the day on which the issuer has the right to redeem a callable bond at par or at a small premium to par prior to the stated maturity date. And so this comes into play a lot of times whenever you're trying to pay off a bond early, either through a refunding or whatever means. There are certain dates in the language of the bonds to where you cannot pay them off before a certain date. Investors want some kind of guarantee that they're going to accumulate interest on these bonds for a certain period of time. And so they will not let you pay off the bond before a certain date. And this comes into play whenever you're refunding, because if you refund a bond before it's allowed to be called, you still have to continue paying the interest on those refunded bonds until the call date. And so, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but just a few things on bond repayments. So now we're going to get into what your financing team looks like. You've gone through the questions that we talked about earlier. You've decided that a bond is the right tool for you to accomplish this project. And so now you need to work with a team to make this happen. So here are the key players in this team. First is a municipal advisor. This is a person who acts as a fiduciary for the government. So they have your interests are what they are trying to satisfy. They're trying to make sure that you get the best deal possible. The underwriter, they have an arm's length relationship with the government. And so this underwriter has a different relationship from your advisor. They want a fair market value transaction, and they're kind of working with you. They're also working with the buyers as well. They provide proceeds at closing. They manage the affairs of the underwriting syndicate. And we're going to get more into what makes up the underwriting syndicate here in just a minute. And then you have a bond counsel. That's your legal assistants. They help draft the bond resolution, the indenture, the loan agreement. They review applicable laws to make sure that no laws are being broken. And so they help guide you through the transaction. And then rating agencies, that's something that Keith is going to get into a little bit more later. They assess the credit quality of the bonds, which will then affect what the interest rate is on the bond. And so those are typically the key players that you'll see in a bond issuance. Those are the key people that you'll work with whenever you're going through it. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that first one, a municipal advisor. So here's a question that a lot of governments ask whenever they're getting into this process. Do you need a municipal bond advisor? So what do? Well, they help you develop a financing plan. They help you evaluate the underwriter. Like we said, the underwriter does an arm's length transaction with you. And so they're evaluating how proper that is. They're helping you evaluate, picking some of the key players in this team. They prepare rating agency presentations. They do this often. And so that may provide some value to you in getting a better rating if they're able to know some of the key ways to present your material to those rating agencies. And then they evaluate market conditions and pricing performance. So they kind of evaluate, is now the best time to be issuing this bond? Can we wait 3 months and it might look better, or 6 months and it might look better? They help you with that. So they're your advocate. So obviously they provide some benefits. The key question to ask here is do those benefits outweigh the cost of a municipal bond advisor? And so they obviously get compensated. They can be compensated through a fixed fee arrangement, an hourly fee arrangement, or in some cases, a contingent fee. And so those are some of the questions that we need to ask whenever we're trying to decide, do we need a municipal bond advisor or not? All right, so let's look at the underwriting team. The underwriters are the group that you're going to spend the most time with in this bond issuance process. They're responsible for purchasing the issuer's bonds and then selling them to investors in the primary market. Their team is typically made up of a senior manager who is the leader of the underwriting syndicate. They actually execute the priority of orders for the bonds. They accept orders, they allocate the bonds. They are the team lead for the underwriters. You also have co-managers. They are mainly dealing with marketing the bonds and submitting orders to their senior manager. And then you have selling group members. These are dealers that assist in selling and marketing bonds in the primary market. A little bit more on underwriters. They also help to develop a marketing plan. How are you going to get the information about these bonds out? Are you going to use conference calls or memorandums? Where are you going to put your notices in different kinds of publications? What are the best places to put those? Where are the best places to advertise this bond issuance? They're going to identify who the target investors are for this bond issuance. Some bonds are better suited for institutional investors. Some bonds are better suited for retail investors. And then they're going to discuss retention with you if they think that's applicable. And that's where you hold back some of the bonds in favor of selling them to institutional investors, which might be a better option for your government. And so that's the underwriting team. Like I said, they're the group that you're going to spend the most time with. They're the group that is most involved in this process. And so that's what their team looks like. And with that, we're going to go to our third polling question.
Thank you, Tyler. I'll go ahead and launch polling question number 3. And that one asks, what is something a municipal bond advisor does? Is it develop financing plan, evaluate underwriter, prepare rating agency presentation, or all of the above? And I'll just mention on the first couple of polling questions, one of our participants said the pop-up didn't, for the polling question, they didn't pop up on their screen. The instruction there is if that happens to you, if you log out and log back in, that seems to resolve it. I think it was just a one-off incident, but if that does happen to you, log out and log back in and it should be resolved. So I'll go ahead and give about 10 more seconds here to answer this polling question. Okay, the vast majority of the answers are in, so I'll wrap it up pretty shortly here. I'm going to end it shortly, going once, going twice, last chance. Okay, I'm going to end the polling question and share the results. How did they do?
All right, so that's the answer that I had as well. D, all of the above. So they do help develop a financing plan. They do help you evaluate the underwriter, and they also help prepare rating agency presentations. So looks like most people got that one. We'll have one more polling question, Rob.
Okay, let's see number 4. Polling question number 4 asks, actually, let me launch it and then I'll read it. There we go. This one asks, what professionals are involved in municipal bond financing? Is it an underwriter, an issuer, bond counsel, or all of the above? I can see answers coming in pretty quickly here, so about 10 more seconds. So as I said at the beginning a couple of times, you do not need to get the answer correct, but you do need to answer in order to get in order to get your CPE credit. So if you're not sure, at least put down an answer to get your credit. Okay, last couple of seconds here, going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, Tyler, how about that one?
Yep. So it looks like most people got that one as well. I think we're seeing a theme here. Apparently, I like all of the above. So I'm really hoping that in one of these later poll questions, I tricked you guys and put all the above, but it's not the answer. But in this case, it is. Municipal bond financing, you'll typically see an underwriter. You obviously have an issuer, and typically you have a bond counsel as well. So D, all of the above. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith on the role of bond rating agencies.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tyler. Great job. Rob, both you guys, great job to kick this off this morning. So let's spend a few minutes talking about these bond rating agencies. So what is a bond rating? Well, a bond rating is the isolated function of credit risk evaluation. Credit risk is the possibility of a loss resulting from a borrower's failure to repay a loan or meet contractual obligations. That's what it is. A bond rating does not constitute a recommendation to invest in a bond and does not take into consideration the risk preference of the investor. While many factors go into the investment decision-making process, the bond rating is often the single most important factor affecting the interest cost on most bonds. So what are the bond rating agencies? Well, every bond is rated by at least one bond rating company. A bond rating gives investors important information about a bond and its issuer and allows investors to make an informed decision when deciding whether or not to buy a bond. Bond ratings have become essential tools that investors rely upon when analyzing a bond. Bond rating agencies work somewhat like credit bureaus in that they both research financial information to determine creditworthiness. But instead of assigning an individual's likelihood of repaying their debts, a bond rating agency determines whether the issuer of the debt securities, like bonds, are likely to fulfill their promises to pay interest and repay the principal the investor has loaned them. So the bond investors rely on rating agencies to help them decide whether to invest their money and whether the risk involved in buying a debt security is worth the promised interest rate. Obviously, higher risk bonds need to offer higher interest rates to attract investors. There are three main bond rating agencies in the United States that account for approximately 95% of all bond ratings. And I'm sure you guys are very familiar with those. Fitch Ratings, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's Investor Services. Each of these agencies, they use a proprietary evaluation methodology. So, they may offer differing ratings. That's why you see differing ratings sometimes on the same security. There's also let's talk about the big three that I just mentioned. There are other rating companies in the country, but those are the three primary ones we just mentioned are the ones we want to focus on this morning. So let's start with Fitch. This one was founded in 1913 by John Fitch. Fitch Ratings introduced the AAA through D rating system in the 1920s. This is a rating system. It's also been adopted by S&P Global. They use the same system. And I've got slides a little farther on back to kind of do a comparison between the three agencies. So excuse me, the ratings hierarchy assigns letter grades to debt securities and their issuers. It's not just the debt, but also the issuer itself, based on their likelihood of default, with AAA indicating the high credit worthiness and lowest risk of default, and D signaling an issuer that has entered into bankruptcy. Bonds rated like AAA, AA, triple B, those are considered investment grade, while double B, the alphabet soup there, those are considered speculative or junk grade bonds all the way down to D. And again, we'll look at those in a little more detail here in just a moment. Fitch is the smallest of the three bond rating agencies with 13% of total market share. The largest share of its ratings are for financial institutions, which take up about 24% of the market, followed by 22% of asset-backed securities market, roughly 16% of corporate issuers, and then 16% of insurance companies. And finally, government issuers make up 11% of their ratings. Next is S&P. S&P Global Ratings is both the largest and oldest of the three bond rating agencies. Its history goes back to the 1860 publication of History of the Railroads and Canals of the United States, which businessman Henry Varnum Poor wrote to offer clarity to investors, interested in the railroad industry. That's how this country was built, was the railroads, and back in the middle part of that century was a huge business in this country. Railroads still are today a huge business, but back then that's how this country was really built. S&P Global Ratings, they use essentially the same rating scale as Fitch, as I mentioned before, from AAA to D. With AAA, obviously, the AAA, the investment grade bonds are those with a triple B or above, and speculative or junk bonds are those with double B and below. S&P Global, they command 50% of the bond market. They handle over 54% of the ratings for government securities, 45% for corporate issuers. Has a fairly high percentage of every category with 37% of financial institutions, 32 of insurance companies, 23 of asset-backed securities. The next one's Moody's Investor Services. Again, this one was founded in 1909 by John Moody. It was created in the wake of the 1907 stock market crash. I'm not sure how many of you know of that one, but there was a crash back in 07. The Panic of 07, also known as the Bankers Panic of 07, was a financial crisis that took place in the United States over a 3-week period in the mid-fall of that year. This was when the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, fell almost 50% from its peak from the previous year. That would send a panic, I think, through anybody's portfolio. So anyway, we're also in a recession in our country at that time as well, and there were numerous runs on banks and trust companies, and eventually this panic spread from basically being located primarily in the Northeast throughout the nation, when a lot of state and local banks and businesses also entered bankruptcy. Moody's has a slightly different purpose for evaluating securities. While Fitch and the S&P aim to measure the likelihood that a security might default, Moody's aims to determine, the expected amount of loss in the event there is a default. This difference is one of the reasons why the same securities, may have differing ratings among the agencies. Moody's ratings hierarchy goes from the investment grade of capital A and then 2 little A's. And again, I won't go through all the alphabet there with them. This stuff all gets a little confusing when you start getting into all these different letters. But again, I've got a slide coming up that I think summarizes all that nicely for us. Again, Moody's handles 32% of the bond rating market share. So they're I guess they would be kind of the second largest of the group. The majority of its ratings are for governmental securities, taking up a little over 33% of the market. They also handle about 32% for asset-backed securities and 26% of corporate issuers. Every year, Moody's publishes U.S. municipal bond defaults and recoveries. It's a proprietary study they do on more than 10,000 municipal bond issues it covers. The most recent study covers defaults from 1970 to 2020. Over the past 10 years, the average default rate, which I found this to be really interesting, for investment grade municipal bonds was 0.1% compared to a default rate of 2.25 for corporate issues, or similarly rated corporate issues. So investment grade, 0.1% for the governments, 2.25 for corporate. That's a pretty low default rate, even on investment grade securities. Let's see, I think that's going to bring us to a poll question. Rob, and this is actually a fun poll question. We threw a non-technical poll question in for you guys.
Excellent stuff. Thank you, Keith. Let's launch number 5 and read that one out. And this one asks a bit of a just personal preference question. What is the best James Bond theme song? Is it Nobody Does It Better, Goldfinger, Skyfall, Live and Let Die, or none of the above? So yeah, just like you said, just a fun question there. Quick answers, and we can keep things moving along because I want to make sure everyone gets their credit. Keith, I know your personal preference, and I'm seeing the results come in, and I think you'll be happy. That's all I'm going to say for now. But last couple of seconds here, get your answers in for your CPE credit. Going once, going twice. Okay, Keith, I'm ending the poll, and I'll share the results. What do you think about that, Keith?
I think we have some really smart people attending this webinar. So yeah, I thought about this was just kind of a fun thing to throw in. I read an article in Rolling Stone a while back about this, and I think a lot of people's answers too will depend on your age. Obviously, the Adele fans in the group are going to be probably a little younger. I'm an older guy, so I've seen McCartney in concert. This is one of the key moments in his concerts when they do Live and Let Die, because there's all sorts of pyrotechnics with it, and it's just a great song to see live. But all good stuff. Anyway, just thought I was told I could throw one fun one in there. I got permission to do that. We have to stay on task with the technical stuff. So, but yeah, good deal. Good job, everybody. So let's move on. I think we have another poll question, Rob. This will be poll question number 6.
Okay, let me launch that and read it. This one asks, what ratings agency's purpose is to determine the expected amount of loss in the event of a default? Is it Fitch, Forbes, Moody's, or Standard & Poor's? Okay, so we'll give everyone 20 seconds, make sure everyone's got a chance to get their credit. Okay, about 10 more seconds, most of our answers are in. All right, last couple of chances for anyone. Again, you don't need to get the answer correct, but you do need to answer for credit. So going once, going twice, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Keith?
C is correct. Moody's, that separates Moody's from the other two. That would be the correct answer though. So good job, everybody. All right, let's move along. Staying here with the rating agencies, let's talk about understanding bond ratings. So what is a bond rating? Well, a credit rating provides an easily understandable measure. Again, we talked about risk, because we're talking about the degree of risk of an issuer or government securities. Investors, as I said before, use these ratings to substitute for or to enhance their own research when making a decision on whether or not to purchase your bonds. Credit ratings, they're either investment grade or speculative. A below investment grade rating designation may make an issuer securities ineligible, investments for some institutions. Some of you out there have, or a lot of you out there may have investment policies that prohibit you from investing in speculative grade type securities, and that's true for a lot of organizations. An issuer will usually request a rating prior to the sale of a security from one or more of the 3 rating agencies. Application for a rating is made a few weeks, usually before the planned sale date. This analysis is used to determine your ability as an issuer to pay interest payments and repay face value of the bond as it matures. The issuer will submit several types of information, including drafts of bond documents, audited financial reports, operating capital budgets. Issuers, often decide to make both a written and oral presentation to the rating agency, to help the credit analyst make a more informed valuation. Ratings are assigned once the analyst has made a recommendation, and ratings committees have acted upon that recommendation. Then you get your bond rating assigned to that bond issue that you're trying to put out there. So understanding bond rating. So here's the table I was talking about. Here's, like I mentioned, alphabet soup. It's hard for me to remember all these, so it's good to have this little comparison handy here. So bond ratings, like I said, are assigned to both the organization that issues the bonds and the bond issues themselves. The higher your bond letter rating, the lower the interest rate coupon needs to be, because the issuer has a lower risk of default. Conversely, the lower a bond rating, the more interest you've got to pay to incentivize investors to buy. So obviously, you want to be up there on that first line. I'm just going to use S&P, that middle column, just to make it easier. But that's premium. That AAA is premium. If you drop down to AA plus to AA minus, the next 3, you're talking about a security that would be considered a high grade, still a good investment, you're still going to be able to issue that at a low rate of interest. The next 3, the A plus to the A minus, that's considered upper medium grade. Again, farther down the scale you go, the more you're going to have to pay in interest to entice investors to take your bond. Then you get down to the triple B plus, the last 3 to the triple B minus. That's considered a lower medium grade, and that would be the bottom end of the investment grade ratings. The next section is the speculative grade ratings. And again, a lot of this, if your bond issue falls into this, you may have some problems finding buyers. Again, starting up there at the top, these do have some meaning. So if you look at the BB plus to the BB minus, the first 3, that's considered a non-investment grade speculative security. The next 3, the B plus to the B minus, is considered highly speculative. CCC plus is considered substantial risk. CCCC is extremely speculative. CCC to CCC. I told you I get hung up on this alphabet soup. The next 3 there are basically default as imminent. I don't know why you would want to try to issue bonds if you ended up with anything really in the speculative range. And then D, of course, is default. If you're on that last line, your bonds are in default, or they consider it to be in default. So, and ratings are done throughout. Obviously, once you issue bonds, we're talking about issues here, but ratings can be adjusted throughout the life of the bond. So it's not just on the issue side. All right, so let's talk about some benefits and criticisms of rating agencies here briefly. Just like having a good credit score allows individuals to access more favorable loan terms. Having a good rating from a bond ratings agency helps governments borrow money more cheaply. And ratings can also provide an incentive to governments to stay current with their debts and not take on more debt than they can comfortably afford. On the investor side, bond ratings provide important information about the riskiness of various investments, as we've been saying. Knowing a government's bond ratings can help investors determine how much risk they are willing to take on whether that the promised returns are worth the risk on the bond. Whether an investor is only comfortable purchasing investment grade bonds or willing to take a calculated risk by purchasing junk bonds, having the ratings assigned by the agencies provides another important metric they can use to decide which investments are right for them. Well, there's also some criticisms of bond rating agencies. Having access to these bond ratings can be very helpful to investors. They're not without flaws. There are some problems. Start with bond rating agencies. They're privately owned companies, and bond issuers pay the agencies to rate them. This presents a potential conflict of interest. An investor should always keep this fact in mind when using information from rating agencies. Many experts advise investors to use ratings as just one piece of information for deciding whether to invest, or whether, rather than that being the only piece of information. It can be part of your decision-making process, but should not be the only piece. Additionally, the methodology that these ratings, for rating securities and their issuers is proprietary. It's not always clear why and how these agencies assign their ratings. For example, S&P Global downgraded the U.S. federal government's credit rating for the first time back in 2011 in response to the debt ceiling crisis. Because of this decision by S&P, global markets, declined the following day after the announcement, even though the country showed no sign of default, on our debt, and we've had no problem in the decade, since then on our debt. The evaluation methodology used by rating agencies may also fail to foresee coming problems. It's happened back in 2008. All of you that are, probably remember the financial crisis of 2008. Each of the three major rating agencies gave high ratings to the kinds of mortgage-backed securities that proved to be far riskier than, ratings indicated. Investors who trusted in these ratings were often then overexposed to securities that contributed to the housing bubble correction of that year. And, a lot of our governments and their investment portfolios had a lot of these securities in it as well. So, everybody kind of took a beating back in 2008. What factors are considered in reviewing the credit quality of municipal securities? So, rating a bond issue. Well, in assigning a credit rating, a fundamental concern of the credit analyst is the willingness and ability of the issuer to repay the debt on time and in full. An important part of the ratings process entails a review of the security pledged for the bonds, the revenue source for debt repayment, flow of funds, legal limitations on the pledged revenues, bondholder rights in the event of non-payment, required reserves, and bond covenants. Those are all carefully examined. The rating agencies also focus on different types of information depending on whether the bonds are issued as general obligation bonds, revenue, or short-term securities. Let's start with general obligation bonds. So the credit analyst is going to focus on four primary factors when they're evaluating those GO bonds. They're going to look at debt burden. They're going to perform an assessment of the community's ability to support existing and planned debt obligations using for example, key financial ratios as indicators. Another thing they look at is management practices, a review of the organizations and the powers of the government's administration and the services for which it directly is responsible. They're going to look at financial performance or condition. This is a big one. An analysis of revenue and expenditure trends and the adequacy, dependability and the scope of those revenues. The economic base, an evaluation of the economic outlook for this jurisdiction, focusing on income, population, employment, diversity, and compensation of employers and real estate values. If you've got a declining tax base and you're in a rural area and you've got a declining tax base, that's going to be a risk factor that's going to be considered. I'm going to add a fifth one to this list, and I'm going to throw just the economy in general in there. And we'll talk more about that when I get to the section on trends and things here in just a few minutes. The next bond is like revenue bonds. So the revenue bond credit analysis includes a review of the same areas as the GO bonds we just talked about. In addition, certain unique characteristics of revenue bonds are also looked at. An important consideration is whether or not the service provided by the issuer is and will continue to be demanded by the public. Since fees are often pledged to repay that debt, got to be sure that what's generating those fees is going to be something that's going to be there long term. Review of, there may be a feasibility study that can be an important component of assessing future demand. Revenue bonds are secured by various legal and financial agreements incorporated into the bond resolution or trust indenture. Hence, the credit analysis analysts will carefully review these documents. The rate covenants are of particular interest. These covenants constitute a pledge by the issuer to keep user fees and charges at a level that will cover debt service payments, provide adequate insurance, permit reasonable operation and maintenance of the facility, and ensure adequate reserve funds for capital improvements. The last one, short-term debt. The credit analysis of short-term debt considers many of the same factors we just talked about, although the emphasis may be a little bit different on short-term debt. The amount and timing of revenue receipts are usually of a particular importance for short-term debt. Issuance patterns, they also look at that issuance patterns as well. So a government that's heavy or has a growing reliance on short-term debt might be viewed with some concern by the rating agencies. So what can you do as an issuer to enhance your credit rating? So local officials have limited control over certain factors that enter into a rating decision. However, there are some things and actions and things you can do to help enhance your credit rating. Security for the bonds is often one area over which you as an issuer have some control. Assigning a first line of pledged revenue to the bondholders, strengthening coverage covenants, or establishing a prudent level of reserves provides added assurance to the investors that the issuer will be able to meet debt obligations in a timely manner. Instituting sound management practices and policies also reflects positively on the issuer in the ratings process. As a result, developing and adhering to long-term financial and capital improvement plans, keeping expense growth in line with revenues, and maintaining an adequate level of operating reserves are important factors. Preparation of annual financial reports in accordance with GAAP. And for those of you that are in the GFOA certificate program, that's also a good example of, or good evidence of good financial management. Issuers should develop and maintain good relationships with the rating agencies. This is important. Annual audited financial statements or other important finance documents should be sent routinely. And it's also important for finance officials to keep the ratings agencies informed of any changes that could affect credit quality. In periods of financial stress, finance officials should keep the ratings agencies apprised of actions that the government is taking to address those financial problems. All right, let's, excuse me there, I had to take a little sip of the warm tea. Slept under a ceiling fan last night by mistake, and it's affected my voice this morning. So let's talk about trends in municipal bonds. I had high hopes for this section, but talking with some various experts and things, did not get the information I was hoping for. So we're going to, this is just kind of the one slide here, but I will tell you a couple things about trends for 22. So to do that, let me back up a second and talk about the previous couple of years. So municipal bond new issuance in 2021 was just slightly higher than the previous year. So in 21, we had $475 billion in municipal bond issuance. That's compared to 474 billion in 2020. So very close. I think the general consensus is it will be a little lower in 22 from what I'm understanding, but still should be fairly strong. There are some things to consider or at least be aware of, and none of this is like anything that you guys haven't already heard or seen. If you watch the news, you're going to know this stuff. It's all over the place. It's all around us. The first being the geopolitical conflicts and uncertainty. And the reason I couldn't get any of my experts I spoke with, I couldn't pin anybody down on anything of what they thought would happen. It's because of what's on this slide. There's just a lot of uncertainty in the world right now. Obviously, with the geopolitical issues, back on February 24th, I think it was, is when Russia invaded Ukraine. We have that mess going on. You know, it's while we have stopped purchasing, I think we were purchasing 3% of our oil from Russia. We have since stopped all of that as part of the Biden administration sanctions. Europe's in a different position because the European community relies heavily on that. So they're unable to necessarily do that. And that's the sanctions are one of the ways I think we're hoping that we can bring this issue over there to a conclusion sooner rather than later, but I don't see that happening. And I don't think that the experts, again, that I watch on the news and listen to expect that to happen. You're not dealing with a leader in Russia that's going to be, I think until he reaches his final objective, he's not going to quit. So, but anyway, another thing to think about too, that conflict, we may not think that impacts us, but the number 1 and number 5 wheat producers in the world or exporters, Russia's 1, Ukraine's 5. You guys, I won't go through the laundry list of what all goes into wheat, what all the wheat goes into, but that's a big item in our food supply. So you have two of the top 5 producers of that, exporters of that, involved in a war. So that could create some issues down the road as far as in the food supply situation, or at least in prices. The bigger issue, though, really for us is in inflation in this country. Inflation is at its highest in 40 years, spurred by the coronavirus pandemic. I thought this was kind of interesting when I was doing some reading and research. 50.7%, or approximately 166 million Americans, were not even born the last time we experienced inflation of this level. So for a bunch of you out there, this is a new experience. I'm old enough to remember the last time we had high inflation. I don't remember a lot about it because it's been so long ago, but definitely, it's certainly noticeable at the grocery store and at the gas pumps, and everywhere we go, it's very noticeable. In March of 22, the CPI increased 8.5% over the prior year. If you take out food and fuel, which is the 2 big drivers, it was still 6.5% over the previous year. That's pretty high. Back pre-pandemic, it was running under 2%. So you get an idea of how that's how much that's gone up. So the Federal, like I said, the Federal Reserve raised interest rate. I think it was in March, 25 basis points. They're expected to raise interest rates again, possibly by another 5 times this year, anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 point again to try to slow down inflation. The Federal Reserve, they have a few main goals, focusing on the economy. One is to promote maximum employment, keep prices stable, and have moderate long-term interest rates. Generally, the central bank aims to keep inflation around 2% annually. Obviously, we've gone way past that. The Fed uses interest rates. I'm talking about interest rate hikes. Again, as far as bonds go, you're going to see the rates you pay if you're looking at issuing, bonds anytime in the next year. The rates you pay are obviously going to be going up. I don't see how that does not happen. The Fed uses interest rates as either a gas pedal or a brake on the economy, in case you're interested of how to control things. Their main tool to battle inflation. And it does so by setting the short-term borrowing rate for commercial banks. And those banks pass it on to us, consumers, businesses. The rate influences everything from interest on your credit cards to your mortgages to car loans to making borrow. It just makes borrowing more expensive. On the flip side, it also boosts rates on high yield savings accounts. That's, I guess, a good thing. But anyway, they want to make borrowing more expensive again. It helps to, by basically making it more expensive to borrow money. They're hoping to cool off demand and bring prices back in check. Could also have a secondary effect on alleviating supply chain issues. Demand goes down. Hopefully, supply chain issues may straighten out. But that's, again, all that stemming from the pandemic. Some things could go wrong. They could overdo it they could move too quickly on interest rate hikes and dampening demand too much, slowing down the economic recovery, and could even lead to inflation. So, to recession. We already have an inflation. We don't need any more of that. Could lead to recession. So basically, 22 is kind of just a lot of uncertainty this year. And none of these problems are going to get fixed quickly. So anyway, that's my take on the trends. That probably wasn't very helpful to anybody, but it's hard. There's just too many unknowns out there right now to predict what's going to happen this year. I think going back to some things Tyler has mentioned earlier in his presentation, if you're a government, if you guys are considering a bond issue this year, just talk to your advisors, talk to your team and see, what's recommended, how to move forward. You may need to move forward quickly. I don't know, but again, reach out to your team. All right, that's going to bring us to a poll question. Rob, if you're
I'm ready for it.
ready,
So
you're old.
yeah, let's go ahead and do 7. So this one, I'll launch it and read it. This one asks, on the Standard & Poor's rating scale, what is considered investment grade? A+, double B+, triple C, D, or none of the above? And whilst everyone's getting their answers in there, Keith, I'll commend you for touching on the subject of bond trends. It's obviously no one expects you to have a crystal ball and predict the future. And like you said, just so much uncertainty out there. It's impossible to give a real prediction. But I think you did a great job of giving some of the things to consider and some of the things that are influencing that we can be watching for to kind of get a feel of where things might be going by just understanding what influences. So good job, Keith, on taking that on.
Thank you, Bob.
So most people have got their answers in, so I'm going to give just a few more seconds here. So going once, going twice, and I will end the poll. And Keith, there's the results. How did people do?
They did great. A+. Everybody got an A+. A+ was the right answer. Everybody got an A+. Yeah, obviously you certainly want that investment grade security is what you're wanting to issue, and that's what investors are looking for. I'm sure there's a market out there for the junk stuff too. There used to be a big market for it, and I guess if you're a savvy investor and you know how to really look at the issuer and evaluate, but I think that's probably a very small number of investors that can do that. So, all right, I think we're going to turn this back over to Tyler now. If I can get my slides going again, there we go.
That's right. Thank you, Keith. And I know, as Keith mentioned, he and I were both very excited about diving into that current trends. And we held several calls with market experts. Whenever we started talking about this thing, I think it was back in December or January, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong. But since then, inflation has just skyrocketed and we have a significant war going on. And so it's just caused all kinds of uncertainty. And so it's made these things tough to discuss, tough to predict.
Yeah, we got a massive shoulder shrug, didn't we, when we asked the question of people we thought would really know. They just kind of go, we don't know. Yeah,
that's the truth. Okay, so we're going to get into talking about some types of bonds. There are different types of bonds. Keith has touched on rating these couple of types that we've talked about, and then we're going to talk about the reporting requirements. So the first bond type that we'll talk about is revenue bonds. These are bonds that are issued for a specific project or system, such as water or sewer infrastructure. and then the bond is repaid from the revenues that are received from that specific project or system. So these bonds are backed by specific project revenues or sources. And in a lot of the discussions that we had with some of the investors in the bond market, they talked about how they had typically seen better, lower default rates in revenue bonds because there is a specific revenue stream tied to it. So people are going to generally keep paying their water bill or their sewer bill. And so those are a little more guaranteed than the next type that we're going to talk about, which is general obligation bonds. And so this is the second common tax exempt municipal bond that you will see. There are several other types of bonds that are taxable. We don't typically see those because the main benefit of municipal bonds is that it provides tax-free interest to investors. So on general obligation bonds, these are not backed by revenues from a specific project. As Keith mentioned earlier, they're backed by the full faith and credit of the state or local government that issues the bonds. And so he mentioned whenever these rating agencies are looking at these type of bonds, they're looking at the community, what the population increase or decrease looks like. A lot of different factors go into that. And so these tend to be a little more risky for investors. But sometimes governmental entities will pledge specific revenues, such as certain sales taxes or certain types of taxes to pay for these bonds. And then that helps bring down the credit rating of the bond. It helps bring down the interest rate that you'll be paying on the bond and provide some additional assurance to the investors. And so those are some things that the governments can do to assist with those general obligation bond issuances. Excuse me. And then sometimes we will see bonds are issued through what we call conduit financing. So what is conduit financing? I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this in process, but what is it exactly? It's basically where a state or local government authority will issue a bond on behalf of a third party. And so sometimes you'll see that where maybe a local governmental authority issues a bond on behalf of a school board because they might have a better credit rating than the school board and can get more beneficial financing. Sometimes it's for a private third party and allows them to get lower borrowing costs for projects that will benefit the public good. So that's one of the pros of conduit financing is it allows entities to get lower borrowing costs than they typically would be able to get. Obviously, there's also tax benefits. If a local governmental authority issues a bond, there's obviously some tax benefits from the tax-free interest on the bonds. And then one of the cons is that obviously in these situations, there is greater risk associated with the bond. So the financing obligation lies with whoever the conduit issuer is. But nonetheless, there's still some increased risk just because of the additional dynamics that are ongoing in these type of bond issuances. And I know I keep talking about tax benefits. I think that's because, as a lot of you guys know, yesterday was the tax deadline. So for CPAs, we've been very heavily involved in tax benefits and have seen a significant amount of municipal bonds that are tax-free. And so that's top of mind, but I know that's top of mind for a lot of investors as well. All right, so those are the general type of bonds. There are a lot of other bonds that you can issue. Those are typically not tax-free bonds, and so those are not the typical ones that we see. I would say between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds, that's about 99.99% of the bond issuances that we see from governments. And so those are the only ones we're going to cover today. So we're going to move on to talking about once you have issued the bond, well, then what? You've issued the bond. We've gone through the questions that you ask prior to issuance to see if that's the right idea for your government. We have gone through what the financing team looks like. Keith has walked us through what the credit rating process looks like, how that impacts your bond. So we've kind of walked through all of the key factors in issuing a bond. And so then the question becomes, then what? Well, then what do you do after the bond issuance? Well, obviously you have to pay for the bond. I think that's probably top of the list there. but also generally there's an obligation to meet certain reporting requirements. And those requirements fall under SEC Rule 15C2-12. And this reporting is completed through the Electronic Municipal Market Access, more commonly known as EMMA. And this is on the msrb.org website that we mentioned earlier. This is where you will do your reporting. And this is reporting that's required after a bond issuances in a lot of cases. So this next slide, we're going to look through when is this reporting required. So this graph has a lot going on. It's like reading Greek to me. So I'm just going to give you guys kind of a general overview, some of these specific facts and circumstances. You can find this flow chart on the MSRB state and local government toolkit. But generally, continuing disclosures are required if your bond has not matured or been refunded. It was issued after July of 1995, and it was issued for more than $1 million. So most bonds that have been issued that are still outstanding fall under these continuing disclosure requirements. And so again, if you can look at your specific circumstances, there's all kinds of different questions that you have to go through in this checklist to determine if you have to comply or not. But for the most part, those few things: your bond was issued after 1995, it hasn't matured, it hasn't been refunded, and it was over $1 million. Typically, you have to meet these continuing disclosure requirements. So what kind of things are required in these continuing disclosure requirements? Well, it's a lot of the same things that are required whenever you're issuing a bond. So Keith mentioned that you'll have to turn in audited financial statements. You'll have to turn in annual financial and demographic information in order for the investors to continue evaluating it. You'll also have to discuss specific events that may have an effect on repayment of a bond. So if you have a principal or interest payment delinquency, you have to report that. If you have called any of your bonds, you also have to report that. And then if there are any rating changes for your entity, that also has to be reported on this EMMA website. And it just kind of functions as a hub for gathering information on all municipal bond, governmental bond issuers. And so one of the main things that's top of mind for us right now is most of our governmental entities, or a significant portion of the ones that Keith and I work with, are September 30th year ends. And so their continuing disclosure reporting requirement for most of them falls on March 31st. And so we just went through this process with a lot of our governmental entities. And I just want to go over one of the typical pitfalls that we see, and that's around audited financial information. So typically, that is required within 6 months of the end of the entity's fiscal year, or sooner if available. So one of the new governmental audits that we're working on last year, their audit was not completed prior to the March 31st deadline that they had for this continuing disclosure reporting. And so what happens then, if you don't submit financial information as required, you get what's called a notice of failure to file. And for them, if they had missed that deadline for 2 years in a row, it was going to increase their credit rating. So obviously it was something that was very important to this governmental entity. And so we hopped on the phone in March and discussed this with their bond counsel and discussed, what options were available. If an audited financial statement was not available at March 31st, what could you do? And in most cases, what you'll find is that you can just submit unaudited information. Obviously, you got to clear this with your bond professionals, but in most cases, you can submit unaudited financial information until the audited information becomes available. And that will keep you from getting the notice of failure to file, which can have some significant impact on your entity, such as increasing your credit rating, notifying investors that that you had a failure in your reporting requirements. And so all these things that might negatively impact you can be avoided by having a phone call and submitting some unaudited information until the audited information becomes available. So with that, we're going to move into polling question number 8.
Thank you, Tyler. I'll go ahead and get number 8 launched. This one asks, which of the following is a common type of bond issuance? James Bond Signature Series, General Obligation Bond, Revenue Bond, Tax Exempt Bond. So give everyone a few moments here to get their answers in.
And one thing, Rob, I think I left out the ever important word not. Which of the following is not a common type of bond issuance?
So we will not penalize anyone for getting this one the wrong way around, but I can see a few answers coming in the other direction now. Now you've clarified that, but yeah, don't worry about getting these right. We just need you to answer in order to get your credit. Whilst the last few answers are coming in, I'll mention we did have one participant raise their hand earlier. Unfortunately, I cannot give audio control or get anyone to speak from the participants on here. So if you did have a question, please type that into the Q&A. It could have just been an accidental click on the raise hand button, but if there's a question, yeah, Q&As are the way to do that, or type those in. And with that, I think everyone's had enough time, so I'll just wrap it up quickly with the last couple of seconds to get your answers in. And I'm going to end the poll there and share those results. Tyler, what do you make of the results?
Yeah, it sounds like the person that wrote this polling question made a mistake and misled people. So I apologize for that. The answer that I was going for was A, the James Bond Signature Series is not a common type of bond issuance, at least that I've seen here in America. So my apologies there. I told you guys I was going to trick you later, though, so maybe that's what it was.
Okay, well, let's see how we do. We've got another polling question, I think, next. So let's see how this one goes. Number 9, I will launch that and read it. Number 9 asks, when are you continuing disclosures typically due? When are your typical, sorry, Tyler, I'm tricking everyone now by struggling, so let me try again. When are your continuing disclosures typically due? 30 days after year end, 6 months after year end, 90 days after year end, or 9 months after year end. And I'll give everyone maybe 10 more seconds because we've got a lot of answers already in. So let's wrap this one up. Okay, last couple of moments to get your answers in, get your CPE credit. Like I said earlier, you need to answer 80% to get your CPE credit. So try and answer as many as you can. I'm going to end the poll now and share those results. Tyler, how did people do?
Yeah, so it looks like most people got this one correct. 6 months after year end is typically when those continuing disclosures are due. This might vary for some entities, but typically 6 months after year end is when they're due. As Rob mentioned, obviously you don't have to get it right. You just got to answer the poll questions. So now we're going to move on to bond accounting. You've issued your bond. You've complied with your continuing disclosures. What kind of accounting entries do you need to make? What are some common bond accounting terms that you might have seen over your time dealing with bond issuances that just give everybody a refresher? So the first one is a refunding. A refunding is an issuance of new debt whose proceeds are used to repay previously issued debt. And this is something, as I mentioned earlier, that was very common. Saw a significant amount of these over the last 5 to 7 years as interest rates have been historically low. A lot of entities have taken advantage of that, and they have basically refinanced their bonds by refunding their original issuance, issuing a new set of bonds in their place, and in turn lowering their interest rate because of the current market environment where interest rates have been lower over the past few years. And so, as we mentioned in the short term, with the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, we might not see as many refundings, but nonetheless, that's a common bond accounting term that you might have seen. The next one goes hand in hand with a refunding, and that's defeasance. So that's where a debtor irrevocably places cash or other assets with an escrow agent in a trust to be used solely for satisfying scheduled payments of both interest and principal of the defeased debt. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Your bonds have what's called a call date, and you cannot actually pay off those bonds prior to the call date. So if you issue a refunding in order to take advantage of a lower interest rate environment, a lot of times the bonds that you're paying off can't actually be paid off for several more years. And so in that case, you are required to place enough cash with an escrow agent to pay off those bonds plus the interest rate, plus the interest payments, that are required until the bonds can be called. And so that's what defeasance is. These bonds do come off of your books in the accounting world. However, they have not been paid off yet. So there are some disclosures that are still required from those. And then the next common term that you will see is the carrying amount. So what is that? Well, that's the amount due at maturity. This is adjusted for any premium or discount that was issued with the bonds, the unamortized portion of that. So that's the carrying amount of your bond. A few more terms that we typically see in bond accounting. Number one is a premium or a discount. That's when market conditions change before a bond with a stated interest rate is issued. A premium or a discount may result from the sale. So we've talked a lot about the bond issuance process this morning. A lot of the things that we've talked about obviously take some time. So bond rating presentations, dealing with underwriters, credit ratings, bond counsel, drawing up documents, all of those things take some time. So from the moment that your bond is rated to the time that it goes to market, from the time that it's priced to the time that it actually goes to being sold, conditions change. And in that period of time, we account for that by adding a premium or a discount to the bond to put it at the current rate whenever it's issued. Bond issuance cost. These are expenses that the government has to pay whenever they're selling these bonds. These include things like registration fees, legal fees, the cost of printing, underwriting fees. There are several different types of bond issuance costs, but those are some of the common ones. So let's look at refundings in a little bit more detail, and then we're actually going to walk through reporting debt in governmental funds and then reporting debt after issuance. So a refunding, as we talked about, is an issuance of new debt whose proceeds are used to repay previously issued debt. So why do we have what's called a deferred loss on refunding in a lot of these cases where we refund debt? Well, you calculate that by calculating the reacquisition price. So this is the amount that is transferred to the paying agent. This is the amount that is transferred to pay off the bonds that are being refunded. You subtract what we just talked about, the carrying amount of the refunded bond. So that's the principal due, any discounts, any unamortized premiums, any accrued interest, all those type things factor into what the carrying amount of the bond is. And then this equals your deferred loss, or in one case that I've seen, your deferred gain on refunding. And this is then amortized. So why does this happen? Well, it's what we just talked about on our previous slide. Whenever you refund bonds, sometimes those bonds cannot be called until several years later. And so you have to continue paying interest to investors. That is typically the main component that results in a deferred loss on refunding. And that gets reported on your financial statements. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you lost money whenever you refunded this. You'll also see that in cases where there are refundings of bonds, you'll see that there are calculations called the economic gain from refunding bonds. And you'll see that over the life of the bonds, you end up paying less money in interest and principal than you would have under the bonds that you refunded. And so that's a question I get a lot of time from clients. We just went through this rigorous process. We refunded these bonds to get a lower interest rate. We were shown an economic gain that we're going to get. Why do our financial statements show a deferred loss on refunding? And that's why. It's not saying that you lost money in the long run on this bond. It's simply trying to calculate the amount of additional payments that you had to make to refund the bond over the carrying amount of the bond that was refunded. And so that's a common question that I typically see. So now we're going to move on to some journal entries. I get to feel like a professor. It takes me back to my college days where you get a scenario and then we'll flip to the next slide and go over the correct reporting of that. So I'll read through this and then I'll give you guys just a minute, Keith, if we can. And then we'll flip over to the next slide, which will talk about the journal entries. So I'll read this. Some of you guys might have already read it. Assume the city of Albert received general obligation bond proceeds of $1 million. Let's ignore issuance costs. This happened on June 30th, the last day of its fiscal year. It was restricted to financing of specific general capital asset projects. Let's also assume this is the only debt issued and outstanding. So we're just trying to calculate a simple bond issuance. The journal entries needed to report the debt issuance in governmental funds would be as follows. I think I probably gave everybody enough time. Thank you, Keith. All right, so in governmental accounting, you have governmental fund level accounting, you have government-wide accounting, and then you have your business activities that will report this separately. So right now, we are just talking about the government fund level accounting for this issuance. You received $1 million in cash for the proceeds from the issuance of debt. So this is a very straightforward journal entry that you'll need to make in order to account for this bond issuance. You'll debit cash by $1 million. You will credit proceeds from issuance of debt by $1 million. And you will have recorded this bond issuance. So that was a fairly straightforward one. These debt proceeds will be another financing source for your governmental fund. So let's move on to the next one. This one has a few more variables involved in it, some things that you commonly see in a bond issuance. And we'll walk through the accounting treatment for this and the governmental funds on the modified accrual basis, and then on the full accrual basis. So assume that Cocoa City issues $5 million of long-term general obligation bonds to finance its road reconstruction program. Also assume that debt issuance costs are $40,000, including $5,000 for bond insurance, and that the bonds were issued at a discount of $50,000. Both were deducted from the bond proceeds remitted to the government. The following entry would be made to record the debt issuance at the closing date. Okay, so the debt proceeds was $5 million. So we are going to issue a credit in our accounting system to debt proceeds, which is another financing source of $5 million. We're going to record those issuance costs. Those are going to be a debt service expenditure to our governmental entity. That's going to create a debit of $40,000. And then we are going to account for the debt discount. That's going to be another financing use in your governmental fund, which will result in a debit of $50,000. And then we're going to report how much cash we actually received, which was $4,910,000. And so that's how you would record that at the governmental fund level. How would you record that at the accrual basis level? So if you have a full-blown accrual basis journal entry at issuance, it would look, fairly similar. You got $4,910,000 in cash. That's going to be the same entry. You're going to debit that. You're going to credit a bond payable a long-term liability of $5 million, you're going to debit an original issue discount of $50,000, which will be amortized over the life of the bonds. And then you're going to record a debit to bond issuance costs and expenditure of $40,000. So that's how you would account for it on the full-blown accrual basis. So those are looking at issuance of bonds. Let's look at continued servicing of bonds. So let's look at some payments. Assume that Party City remits $250,000 annual bond principal and $300,000 interest payable on its general long-term debt to a fiscal agent who makes annual payments to bondholders. So let's pay close attention to that. They remit this to a fiscal agent who will then make the annual payments to the bondholders. So it doesn't necessarily say that the bonds were due. At that point, it has not left the custody of the fiscal agent. It has just been sent to the fiscal agent. So this is something that commonly happens in the governmental world, is that the money will be sent to the fiscal agent. So what are the entries at the governmental fund level for this transaction? All right, so all that has happened at this point, no principal or interest has been paid. So to record this payment prior to that being due, the only change is that you will debit cash with fiscal agent, which will be restricted, and you will credit cash. So that's the only transaction that happened at this point. Principal and interest does not need to be recorded since it is not due. The cash is sitting with a fiscal agent, so it is restricted, but it is still in the form of cash. It has not actually paid down the obligation at this point. So what if we change the scenario to where the cash actually was due, the payment actually was due, and the cash was paid to decrease the bond obligation? Well, in that case, you would then credit the cash with fiscal agent by $550,000 because it has left the fiscal agent's custody. You will then make two debit entries, one to debt service expenditure principal, one to debt service expenditure interest. And again, this is reporting it in the governmental fund level. So how would you report this subsequent payment on the accrual basis? Well, it'll look fairly similar. You're still going to credit cash with the fiscal agent by $550,000. You are still going to have a debit to interest expense of $300,000. The only difference is that you're going to decrease that liability, that bond payable, with a debit of $250,000 when the principal is paid and when this is due to the entity. So I know those are very, very high level journal entries, but I kind of wanted to do a catch-all of just some common journal entries that we see in these bond issuances and bond payments. And I know that one about cash with the fiscal agent is one that gets a little tricky. A lot of times governmental entities will go ahead and record principal and interest payments, but at year end, the money is actually still sitting with a fiscal agent. So it has not been actually paid out to relieve any obligation at that point. So it should not decrease the bond payable. It shouldn't be a debit to interest expense, or at the governmental fund level, a debit to debt service expenditures for principal. And so that's one common pitfall that I see. So we've looked at a few example journal entries. We're going to have a couple more polling questions now, so I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thank you very much, Professor Dunaway. Those were excellent examples, so thank you. I will go ahead and launch polling question number 10. And this one asks, which of the following is a common bond accounting term? Premium, discount, defeasance, or all of the above? So answers are coming in pretty quickly here, but I'll give everyone, let's say, another 15 seconds or so. After this one, we just have 2 polling questions left. There's 12 in total. So we are on the home stretch. Okay, last couple of moments to get your answers in. Once again, you need 80% of the questions to be answered for credit. So last chance on this one. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there and share the results. Tyler?
Well done. So those are all correct answers. A premium, a discount, defeasance, those are all common bond accounting terms. So therefore D is the correct choice, all of the above. Good job.
Okay, straight into question 11. Let me launch this one. And this one asks, this arises when market conditions change before a bond with a stated interest rate is issued. So what does that scenario describe? Is it a discount or premium? Is that a defeasance? Is that a refunding? Or is that a call date? So I'll ask the question again. This arises when market conditions change before a bond with a stated interest rate is issued. Okay, we're a little slower getting the answers in. I see the results coming in, but let's give it 10 more seconds. So if you're not sure, put down your best guess to make sure you get credit before I wrap this one up here in a few seconds. Okay, last chance to get your answers in and get your credit. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there. Share the results. Tyler, how did everybody do?
Yep, looks like 76% of people picked A, which is the correct answer. Once your bond has been priced, but before it has actually been issued, market conditions often change, and this is accounted for by a discount or a premium. So good job. I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
All right, well, thank you, Tyler. We're going to take just the last few minutes of our session here to talk about arbitrage. I was just in here thinking arbitrage would make a great name for the next James Bond villain. So I can't hear the laughter, but that's got to be funny. I'm sorry. So all right, let's get going. So what's the purpose of federal arbitrage restrictions? In its application to the tax-exempt market, arbitrage is the difference between the yield on an issuer's tax-exempt bonds and the investment income earned on the proceeds. Arbitrage profits are earned when lower yielding tax-exempt bond proceeds are invested in higher yielding taxable securities. Most state and local governmental entities enjoy the benefit of issuing tax-exempt debt obligations. To issuers, tax-exempt obligations provide significant interest rate savings over conventional debt that generate taxable income for investors. So to the federal government, the issuance of tax-exempt debt represents a loss of tax revenue because investors do not pay federal income taxes on the interest earned on these securities. Arbitrage restrictions were put in place by the federal government for basically 2 reasons. First was to ensure that the proceeds of tax-exempt financings are not solely being used to make investments in higher yielding taxable securities. So they didn't want you issuing your bonds and then investing it and making money off of it. To ensure, and the other one was also to ensure that bond proceeds are spent in an expeditious manner. In general, arbitrage restrictions imposed by the federal government prohibit an issuer from retaining arbitrage profits when you invest those bond proceeds at a yield that exceeds the yield on your bonds. That's basically what we're talking about. And any excess arbitrage has to be rebated to the U.S. Treasury. There are some exceptions, and we're going to talk about those next. So you may be exempt from the rebate requirement. A small issue exception for governmental units with taxing authority, if you expect to issue $5 million or less, or excuse me, $10 million or less for school districts, of tax exempt debt each calendar year. So that small, and I see a lot of this with a lot of my smaller governments I work with. There's also a 6-month exception in cases where all bond proceeds are expended for governmental purposes within 6 months of the issuance date. Again, probably applies to a lot of you guys. Most governments, when they issue debt, have projects ready to go. An 18-month exception for the bonds is issued for governmental purposes for capital projects where the proceeds will be spent over an 18-month period in a specified manner. And there's also a 2-year exception of at least 75% of the bond proceeds will be used to finance governmental purpose construction projects, and where the construction proceeds are spent over a 2-year period in a specific manner. And the rules over arbitrage are kind of complicated, so certainly reach out to your advisors, your bond advisors, or reach out to us here at CRI. Some general requirements for calculating the rebate. So rebatable arbitrage must be determined and reported every 5 years if you don't meet one of those exceptions we just talked about. Despite this fact, because we've got some clients that do this, you may compute it, more frequent basis. We've got one I know that does it annually. You can do it more frequently because, all bond proceeds may be expended in a shorter period. The rebate amount represents a liability which must be reported under GAAP. Your rebate liability may be material to your financial statements, so it would need to be reported. The annual computation provides security to bondholders if the issuer is complying with the federal regulations. In addition to the installment computation date required every 5 years I talked about, there's also a final computation that is made on the date on which the last maturity of the issue is retired. The final installment payment, you've got 60 days after all bonds have been retired to make that final payment. All right, and that brings us to, I think, what will be our last poll question, Rob.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. I'm going to do this poll question. We have received a question as well, so stay tuned, presenters. I'm going to hit you with a question after this, but let me launch polling question 12 for our participants. And this one asks, what is the difference between the yield on an issuer's tax-exempt bonds and the investment income earned on the proceeds? Is that difference the discount, the premium, the rating, or arbitrage? So hopefully people were still focused in on your last section here, and a lot of people getting this one correct, Keith, I think. So they obviously were listening closely to you, but I'm going to give everyone 10 more seconds here. A few answers still to come in. Last chance to get this last polling question answered. Okay. Come on, get your last answers in. I can see a couple still not in, but I'm going to wrap it up here. Going once, going twice, and I'm ending the poll here. Keith, I'll share the results.
D would be correct, arbitrage.
Excellent stuff. I'm going to stop sharing there. And we are right about on time, and I've just got a question. Keith, do you have any more slides, or is now a good time? Oh, there we go.
You can ask your question. I was actually going to mention one more thing since we had a couple of minutes. It's not in the slides, but if you want to go ahead and pose your question, you can.
Yeah, so one question we got, and I think it's something that was touched on in the slides, so let's make sure it's nice and clear. The question that came in just asked, so what is the difference between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds? I think, like I said, I think you touched on it, but if we can just make sure it's crystal clear on the difference between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds. I don't know if you or Tyler, whoever wants to take that one.
I can take that one, Keith. Yeah, so on general obligation bonds, a government can make the interest and principal payments related to those using any source of revenue that's available to them. So they can raise taxes if they need to offset a shortfall, or if it encounters some kind of fiscal troubles. And defaults in this case are rare. Revenue bonds that we talked about, those are backed by the revenue produced by a specific project that's being financed by the bond issuer. And once that's completed, the project produces the revenues to then pay back any interest or principal that's due to investors. So that's a revenue bond. And that's the difference in a revenue bond and a general obligation bond.
Excellent, Tyler. Thank you very much. Keith, if you want to add your final point, and then I'll close us out
Yes.
after that.
Yeah, we mentioned bond covenants throughout the presentation, but we really didn't dedicate much time to that. I did want to point out to everyone, be aware in your bond issues of your bond covenants. Make sure you're monitoring those. This is the auditor in me coming out, because this is something as auditors we look at every year. And if you have bond covenants where you see, there's all kinds of different things can be in your bond issue, but if you have something where you see that you are not going to meet that covenant, you have to request a waiver from the bondholders, or certainly talk to your auditors about it to get some guidance, or your bond advisors. But there's that will result in a finding if you've got a bond covenant you didn't comply with. And so I run into this a lot with especially the smaller governments where they're not aware of all the covenants that they have to comply with. And it's important that you do that you be aware, and that you kind of stay on top of those and monitor those throughout the year, so that you're going to be compliant, or you can take action toward year end to get those waivers if you need those waivers. Rob, that's it. I just want to throw that one in there.
I think that's an excellent addition, Keith. Yeah, I'll just second that. As it is one of our required audit procedures. We're going to be looking at those covenants, and I know they can be pretty complicated, and it's good to stay on top of them so that the auditors don't catch anything when they come in and do their checks. So thank you very much. I am going to close us out here and take us to the finish. This is just a mention of another session that we're doing. It's called the Southern Grants Forum. It's something CRI co-hosts with Kirk Private Client Law. It's there. It's going to be in July from the 26th to the 28th, and we have a lot of good content there specific to grants, and there's up to 18 CPE hours available. As well as obviously great networking opportunities with the professionals. So it's been a session, Keith. We've done this session for a good few years now. I don't know how many years exactly, but it's always
this will be year 7.
7th year. So very well attended, very popular session. If you want more details on that, you can check it out at southerngrantsforum.com, and I hope some of you are able to attend and get some good information there. So, as always, check out cricpa.com for other sessions that we're doing. There's a lot of governmental resources, like I said at the beginning, that might be useful to you. We're regularly putting out articles and tools and just other content that's useful. And you can follow us on any of these social media channels that you see on the screen at CRICPA. So please do feel free to follow us. That's all I've got for this session. So I really appreciate everybody's time for listening. I hope you found it useful. Thank you to our presenters as well. Did a fantastic job. And I wish you all a very good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.